The boy had never seen a road like this one. It stretched out like a ribbon of dust and stone, its pale surface shimmering slightly in the midday heat. Around them, the hills rolled gently under the sun, and the only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of sandals on gravel and the distant song of cicadas. Yusuf walked with the slow, practiced gait of someone who had walked many roads. His cloak, brown and sun-faded, swayed with each step, and a leather satchel bounced lightly against his side. Beside him, Selim trotted with youthful energy, his linen tunic flaring slightly in the breeze, a carved wooden toy clutched tightly in one hand. They had left the last village at sunrise. Yusuf had bartered for bread and dried figs in exchange for a pouch of herbs. The vendor, an old woman with a cracked voice, had smiled at Selim and offered him a slice of honey-dipped pastry, which the boy had accepted with wide-eyed gratitude. Now, with the sun just past its peak, the caravanserai was nearly in sight. A low structure built of weathered stone, nestled at the base of a hill where the land dipped into a shaded hollow. "Is it always this quiet?" Selim asked, looking up. His voice was soft, but in the open space it seemed to carry. "It is when the road is kind," Yusuf replied, "and when you walk at the right hour." They reached the arched entrance just as a mule caravan passed by in the opposite direction. A few of the riders nodded respectfully at Yusuf. He returned the gesture with a raised hand. Inside, the shade wrapped around them like cool water. The courtyard was spacious, with a central fountain trickling steadily into a worn stone basin. Around the edges, rooms with heavy wooden doors lined the walls, their thresholds smooth from countless feet. A man emerged from the shadows near the far wall. He wore a simple vest over a clean tunic, and his beard was neatly trimmed. "Peace upon your steps," he said. "And upon yours," Yusuf replied. "You've traveled far?" "Far enough to need a night's rest and a quiet corner," the man nodded and gestured. "You are welcome here. Choose any room with an open door. Water is fresh. Bread and lentils will be served at dusk." Selim looked around, wide-eyed. He had never seen a place like this. He wandered to the fountain and dipped his hands in, letting the water run over his fingers. Yusuf chose a room near the back, shaded and cool. The floor was stone, smooth and clean, with a woven mat in the corner and a clay jug of water beside it. He set down the satchel and removed his sandals. As the day faded, other travelers arrived. A group of merchants with bolts of silk, their donkeys laden with bundles. A quiet woman in dark robes, her eyes hidden beneath a heavy veil. A scholar with ink-stained fingers who sat cross-legged in the courtyard, slowly reading by the fading light. There was little talk, but plenty of nods, small greetings, quiet acknowledgments. Selim, ever curious, watched each one with the fascination of a child in a new world. Later, the aroma of food began to drift through the air. A large clay pot bubbled gently near the communal kitchen, and flatbread was handed out with ladles of warm lentils and a scattering of herbs. They ate on low stools in the courtyard, the food simple but filling. Yusuf chewed slowly, watching the flickering lanterns that had been lit one by one around the square. "Will we stay long?" Selim asked between bites. "Just the night." "Do people live here?" "Some do, some just pass through, like us." After supper, Selim sat by the fountain, carving a tiny face into a piece of wood with the dull edge of a small knife Yusuf had given him. It was a quiet habit of his to leave small carvings behind wherever they stayed. Not for others, necessarily, but perhaps for the place itself. A small sign that someone had been there. That someone had paused long enough to shape something gently. The scholar glanced over once, then returned to his scroll. The woman in robes sat alone by the far wall, a small flame cupped in a clay lamp before her. Yusuf, leaning against the column near their room, closed his eyes for a while. He listened not for danger, but for quiet. For stillness, it was there. In the deep night, Yusuf stirred to the sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not loud, just someone crossing the courtyard. He opened one eye and saw the silhouette of a dervish, barefoot, moving silently across the stones with a small pouch of mulberries in hand. He stopped by the fountain, whispered a prayer, then moved on. Yusuf closed his eyes again. In the morning, they woke early. The courtyard was already alive with movement. Some travelers were packing. Others sat quietly, sipping water or eating cold bread from the night before. Yusuf and Selim washed their faces at the fountain and wrapped their sandals. Before leaving, Selim returned to the fountain ledge and placed his tiny wooden carving next to the worn stone just out of the way, but visible enough for someone to notice. "Ready?" Yusuf asked. The boy nodded. They stepped out into the morning, the sun still low and gold. As they walked away from the caravanserai, neither of them looked back, but both felt its quiet presence settle into them, like something they now carried not in their hands, but in the rhythm of their breath. The road was cooler in the morning, and their steps made less sound. The air carried the scent of wet earth and distant rosemary, stirred gently by the breeze that traveled down from the hills. Selim walked a little ahead of Yusuf now, his carved wooden figure tucked into his sash like a talisman. They spoke little, as if the silence of the caravanserai still clung softly to their shoulders. But the stillness wasn't empty, it was full of the warmth of firelight and shared bread, of the flicker of lanterns, of voices that spoke only what was needed. Yusuf had stayed in many caravanserais across the years, but this one lingered more than most. Perhaps because of Selim, perhaps because of the stillness. As the day grew warmer, the landscape changed. Trees grew thinner, the hills pulled farther apart. Yusuf knew they would reach another village by nightfall, but there was no hurry. Selim had questions today, more than usual, though he asked them quietly and with long pauses between each. Why do people stay only one night? Yusuf glanced at the boy. Because the road is never finished, and because staying too long makes it harder to begin again. But what if they want to stay, if it feels safe? Yusuf smiled, not with amusement, but with memory. Some do stay, but most carry what they need in their shoes, not in stone walls. They stopped near a tree whose bark was deeply grooved, like the pages of an old book. Yusuf unpacked a small bundle of figs and 2 hard-boiled eggs. They sat beneath the shade, the branches above them dancing slightly in the breeze. Selim carved again, a new piece of wood, this time this one smaller, more difficult. He didn't ask for help, Yusuf didn't offer any. When they began walking again, they passed an old shepherd tending goats along a slope. The man raised a hand in greeting, and Yusuf returned the gesture. They shared a moment and nod between people who understood the road. That afternoon, a sudden wind kicked up dust along the trail. Selim covered his eyes, and Yusuf drew his cloak over his mouth. They waited for it to pass, crouched beside a low stone wall, the kind that marked forgotten boundaries. When the wind died down, everything seemed newer, cleaned by grit and air. They reached the village as the sky turned the color of apricots and ash. It was a smaller place with mud brick homes and shuttered windows. The sound of children laughing echoed between the buildings, and a vendor sold roasted chickpeas in little paper cones. Yusuf bought one for Selim, who grinned and handed a few back to him with dusty fingers. They found a room in a local inn, not a caravanserai this time, but a family spare chamber. The mat was thinner, the water warm instead of cool, but it was enough. That night, Yusuf lay awake for a while, staring at the low beams above them. He listened to Selim's breathing, slow and even. The boy had begun to dream more deeply lately, Yusuf could tell. Perhaps from the comfort of shared travel, or the quiet gifts of the caravanserai peace, when found unexpectedly, could take time to sink in. The next few days passed without urgency. Each morning they walked until the sun sat high above them, then rested, then walked again. They'd passed fig trees, dry riverbeds, and once, the crumbled remains of a bathhouse where Selim threw pebbles into the hollows that once held warm water. Yusuf sometimes told small stories, not legends, but real ones, of people he'd met, places that had smelled of cinnamon. A woman who used to mend cloaks with golden thread. Selim listened, not always speaking, but always carving. One evening they came upon a man selling ink in small clay pots. Selim watched, fascinated, as the merchant demonstrated how the ink flowed on cloth, how it darkened as it dried. Yusuf bought a pot and wrapped it carefully in a rag. He didn't ask why. Selim didn't explain. It was enough that the boy wanted it. Later, under a tree, Selim dipped a thin reed into the ink and began to draw on a scrap of cloth. The image was simple, a curved archway, a low wall, a lantern overhead, the caravanserai. Yusuf saw it and said nothing, but he smiled, quietly. The memory lived in them both, in different ways. They passed another caravan one morning, camels, mostly, and carts of dyed wool. One of the drivers offered Selim a dried apricot, and the boy offered him his smallest carving in return. The driver laughed and accepted, holding it up to the sun. "You'll go far," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he meant the carving or the boy himself. That evening, Yusuf sat by a stream while Selim skipped stones. The sky turned slowly overhead, from gold to gray to deep, breathing blue. Yusuf thought about the road not in terms of where it led, but in how it moved through people. Some walked with purpose. Some drifted. Some found the same peace in each place they stopped. Others carried unrest with them no matter how many nights they slept. He had once been that way himself. Now he moved slower. Not because he had grown old, but because he had learned there was no prize at the end of haste. Selim came back with a smooth stone and held it out. "Look," he said. Yusuf nodded, taking the stone, feeling its coolness. "Keep it," he said, and Selim tucked it into his belt. Before sleeping that night, the boy whispered, "Do you think we'll find another caravanserai?" Yusuf looked up at the stars. "There's always another," he said, "but no two are the same." And with that they both fell into silence, carried gently towards sleep by the soft rhythm of insects and the hush of the moving sky. The morning began with a hush that felt deeper than sleep. Even the birds seemed to sing more softly, as if aware that something fragile moved through the day. Yusuf and Selim had awoken early, but neither spoke for a while. They sat on a low wall at the edge of the village, sharing a heel of bread and watching smoke rise in faint ribbons from chimneys. The quiet was not awkward, it had become their shared language, a form of rest that extended even into waking hours. Yusuf glanced at Selim, who was turning the smooth stone from the stream over in his fingers. "What do you think the stone remembers?" the boy asked. Yusuf smiled. "Everything and nothing." That afternoon, the road turned downward, winding through olive groves and dried grasses. The land seemed broader here, and the sky wider. At a fork in the path, they paused. Yusuf consulted nothing. He looked only at the way the light struck the dust and the shape of the wind through the trees. Then he nodded and stepped left. Selim followed without question. By midday, they found a small, half-ruined, shrine-white stone faded to yellow, an open space at its center where once a bowl of water might have sat. Selim walked in slow circles around it, tracing the grooves of ancient carvings with his finger. Yusuf sat in the shade and removed his sandals, letting his toes rest against the warm stones. A lizard darted past, then paused in the sun, unmoving. Time seemed to slow with them. They didn't speak of where they were going. There was no destination beyond the road itself. Selim had once asked if they would ever stop walking entirely. Yusuf had answered only that rest and endings were different things. The boy hadn't asked again. The understanding lived between them now, wordless but solid. At dusk, they reached a plateau where the sky opened like a breath. In the distance, a river shimmered in the last light. They set down their things and made a small camp, not with tents or fire, but with familiarity. Yusuf gathered kindling, not to burn, but to mark the space where they would rest. Selim laid out the blanket, smoothing it with both palms as though preparing a place for memory to lie down beside them. They ate quietly dried dates, flatbread, and a pinch of salt. Selim carved another face, this one more careful, more thoughtful. The features were softer. Yusuf watched him, but said nothing. Some things grew only when unspoken. That night, the stars seemed lower, closer. Selim lay back on the blanket, arms spread, as if to hold them all. "If the sky were a blanket," he whispered, "would it ever wear thin?" Yusuf chuckled low in his chest. "Not while people still look up." They slept beneath the open air. No walls. No roof, just the hush of wind and the comfort of knowing nothing needed to be different than it was. In the deep of night, Yusuf stirred. Not from a sound, but from a feeling. He sat up and saw Selim still sleeping, his face turned toward the stars. For a long moment, Yusuf simply watched. Then he lay back down and closed his eyes again. They woke with the dawn. Not to a rooster or to voices, but to the pale blue silence that comes just before the sun. They packed slowly. Yusuf tied the satchel over his shoulder. Selim slipped the new carving into his sash, and they began walking again. No urgency, no plan. Later that day, they passed a group of laborers hauling stones to rebuild a collapsed bridge. Yusuf offered a hand, and they spent part of the morning lifting, moving, and reshaping what had fallen. Selim helped too, smaller tasks, handing stones or refilling the water bucket from the creek below. When they left, one of the men gave them a warm smile and a small pouch of roasted chickpeas. "For the road," he said, "and for your kindness." The afternoon passed through them like a soft breeze. They said little, but the silence was full. They passed under fig trees. They paused by an abandoned hut with ivy curling through its beams. Selim pointed out a crow sitting like a sentinel on the roof. Yusuf nodded once. They walked on. By evening, the wind picked up. Dust curled across the path, and the sky took on the bruised color of oncoming rain. They found shelter under a rock outcropping, just wide enough for two. The air smelled of sage and earth. Thunder rumbled once but never came close. They sat pressed side by side, watching as the world turned cool and dim. Selim asked, "Did you travel like this before me?" "Yes." "Alone?" Yusuf looked at him. "Not always, but yes, often." "Was it lonelier?" Yusuf paused. "Not lonely, but quieter in the wrong ways." Selim leaned into his side. They said no more. The next morning brought clear skies and sharper light. The colors of the world seemed deeper after the rain. Greens more vibrant, shadows more crisp. They walked past another small caravan, two men and a woman traveling with goats. They exchanged greetings, brief but kind. Eventually the shape of a new village appeared ahead, white walls, red roofs, a bell tower that had once rung but now stood silent. Selim asked, "Will we stop?" Yusuf considered. "A little while." They found a shaded square and sat down near a closed bakery. The smell of flour still clung to the stone. Selim took out the pouch of ink and began to sketch again, this time the bridge they had helped repair. Yusuf leaned back, letting the quiet wrap around him. In the fading light, it was easy to forget what day it was or what place. Everything blurred into stillness, not from confusion but from calm. And when night came again, it was not sudden. It unfolded gently, like a curtain drawn across a well-loved room. They found a bed inside a guest house, low and soft, a clay jug of water waiting near the door. Selim curled into the blanket with barely a word. Yusuf sat for a while longer, watching the stars rise one by one through the window's wooden bars. It had been days since the caravanserai, yet, in a way, it had never left. It lingered in their rhythm, in the way they ate, the way they watched silence settle before speaking, in the way they left small signs behind a carving, a sketch, a shared kindness. Wherever they went, it followed not as a place but as a way of being. The days that followed moved like quiet water. The road dipped and rose again. Yusuf and Selim passed groves of almond trees, their husks crackling underfoot. The breeze turned cooler. Autumn was settling in slowly, brushing the edges of the leaves and whispering change through the canopy. Selim had begun carving longer, more carefully. He asked fewer questions now, but his silences said more. He carried the little pouch of ink as if it were something sacred. One morning, they passed a burial site, a ring of stones beneath a windswept hill. No names, no markers. Just stillness and the rustle of dry grass. Selim paused. "Are they forgotten?" he asked. Yusuf stepped beside him. "Only by those who never passed this way." Selim placed one of his carvings, a plain one, round-faced among the stones. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. They moved on. That afternoon, they reached the edge of another caravanserai, not as well kept as the last one, but still standing. Its stone walls bore the cracks of time, and the iron hinges creaked as they pushed the gate. Inside, the courtyard was wide, ringed with low rooms and a dry fountain in the center. The scent of wood smoke lingered. A few travelers sat on mats, drinking tea or tending tired animals. A young man welcomed them. He wore a long vest and a simple smile. "You're late arrivals," he said. "But the room on the east side is still empty." "It's warmer." Yusuf nodded in thanks. Selim looked around. "It's quieter than the last one," Yusuf agreed. "Quieter places often listen better." They chose a room with a narrow window and a clay lamp already burning. Yusuf laid down the satchel. Selim placed his blanket carefully, then opened the pouch of ink and began sketching again. The dry fountain, the curve of the gate, the face of the smiling man, small fragments held in black lines on rough cloth. That evening, food was simpler bread with oil, lentils without garnish. But it was warm, and the fire in the central brazier drew the travelers together. No one spoke loudly. Most didn't speak at all. The silence was companionable. Selim sat beside an old merchant who slowly repaired a broken sandal strap with thread and a bent needle. The man didn't look up, but he smiled once. Later, under the darkening sky, Selim added another face to his wooden collection smaller than the others, almost a whisper of a carving. When he finished, he set it on the fountain's dry rim, near a tuft of grass that had found a way to grow despite the stone. In the deep hours of night, Yusuf awoke to find Selim gone from the mat. He stepped into the courtyard and found the boy sitting cross-legged near the fountain, eyes open but distant. "Couldn't sleep?" Yusuf asked. Selim shook his head. "It's not that." Yusuf sat beside him. "I keep thinking about the first caravanserai," Selim said softly. "I don't remember everything, but I remember how it felt." Yusuf nodded. "Places speak more through feeling than memory. I think I left something there." "You did." Selim turned to him. "What was it?" Yusuf looked at the dry fountain, at the glow of the lamp through the nearby room. "Your fear, or some part of it." Selim didn't speak again that night. He simply leaned against Yusuf's side, and together they watched the stars shift slowly overhead. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, the young man who had greeted them offered Yusuf a folded scrap of cloth. "The boy left this," he said, "last night." It was one of Selim's drawings, the courtyard, the fountain, a half-formed face. Yusuf smiled. "He leaves things behind everywhere." The man tilted his head. "That's a good habit," Yusuf agreed. "It is." They walked on. In the days that followed, the road brought them to hills that opened like arms. The valleys below were rich with color-golden trees, clay-roofed villages, and the distant glimmer of streams. Children ran beside their path for a short while, laughing before darting off. An old woman gave them warm milk in chipped bowls. A tanner let Selim smell the strange mixture he used to treat hides. Selim wrinkled his nose and laughed, and Yusuf laughed too. They were not in a hurry. One afternoon they sat beneath a walnut tree and ate a meal of dried peaches and olives. Selim took out a smooth strip of bark and drew on it with ink, using a reed sharpened to a fine point. Yusuf watched him, then asked, "Why do you keep drawing the same place?" Selim didn't look up. "Because I'm still finding pieces of it." Later that day, as the sun began to fall, they came across a small shrine beside the path, just a wooden alcove with a rusted lantern hanging above it. Inside sat a tiny carving. Not Selim's, someone else's, old, worn, but still there. Selim blinked in surprise. "Is that?" Yusuf nodded slowly. "Someone else once passed this way?" The two of them stood in silence for a moment, gazing at the carving. Then Selim placed one of his beside it, different, newer, but offered in the same spirit, for the road, for the quiet. For the next to come, that night, they didn't seek shelter. They made camp under a broad sky filled with slow-moving clouds. Yusuf lay back and let the cool air brush over his face. Selim arranged the ink pouch and his wooden figures beside his blanket like small companions. "What do you think the road is?" he asked suddenly. Yusuf took his time. "A line," he said. "That we follow, but it's not just distance. It's memory and meeting and sometimes leaving," Selim nodded. "Then what's a caravanserai?" Yusuf looked into the dark. "A comma." Selim smiled at that. "Not a full stop?" "No, just a place to breathe." They slept with the ease of those who are not searching, but simply being. The wind stirred the leaves. A fox passed by unseen. The ink drawings rested in a cloth pouch. The carvings nestled in folds of a blanket. And the road waited, never in a rush, never expectant, just there. And when morning came, they would rise again, not to finish a journey, but to continue it. With every quiet step, with every soft carving left behind, they were writing a story the road already knew.